Winter shadows swallowed the narrow alley behind Miss Jenny's ballet studio as three hulking figures cornered their prey. The woman's terrified sobs echoed off brick walls while her designer heels clattered frantically against frozen pavement. Michael Reed sat frozen in his battered Ford pickup, 10-year-old Lily's small hand pressed against the fogged rear window, her worn ballet slippers still clutched in her other arm. His battle-scarred hands gripped the cracked steering wheel, knuckles white as bone. 15 years since Afghanistan. 15 years of swearing off violence. Then his daughter's whisper sliced through the December air like shattered glass. "Daddy, can we help her?" The same gentle voice that still asked him to check for monsters under her bed. The question hung between them for one heartbeat. 2 heartbeats. On the third, Michael moved. 4 minutes later, 3 attackers lay motionless in the snow, and everything changed. Because the next morning, 3 gleaming Rolls-Royce limousines would glide into their run-down trailer park, carrying people who would reveal that some acts of courage create debts that reshape entire lives. Michael's combat boots hit the frozen ground with the kind of silence that had once kept him alive in Kandahar province. The first attacker, a linebacker-sized man in a black leather jacket, turned just as Michael's trained fingers found the pressure point below his ear. The man's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled like a demolished building. The sound of his body hitting pavement echoed through the alley like a gunshot. The second attacker spun around, fumbling for something metallic under his coat. Michael's muscle memory took control, 15 years of civilian life evaporating in an instant. A swift disarm, a controlled chokehold, and another body joined the first in the snow. The third man was faster, smarter, more dangerous. He backed toward the dark van, a 9mm pistol gleaming in his grip. "Stay back, soldier boy, or the girl gets it too." His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to violence, but Michael had heard that tone before in Afghan villages where death was currency. Michael feinted left, rolled right, and came up inside the gunman's effective range. One strike to the wrist sent the weapon spinning across ice-covered asphalt. Another to the solar plexus dropped the man gasping to his knees. When silence returned to the alley, 3 bodies lay unconscious in crimson-stained snow. The young woman pressed against the brick wall trembled like a leaf in a hurricane, her platinum blonde hair catching streetlight like spun gold. Designer makeup streaked down porcelain cheeks as she clutched a purse that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent. Her green eyes moved between his scarred hands and the unconscious attackers with the kind of shock that came from witnessing real violence for the first time. "Are you hurt?" Michael's voice carried the gentle tone he reserved for Lily's nightmares, the same soft cadence he'd used to comfort wounded soldiers in field hospitals. "Did they touch you?" Behind him, small footsteps crunched through fresh snow, with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to move quietly around sleeping parents. Lily appeared at his elbow like a guardian angel in a pink tutu, her ballet slippers dangling from one hand while the other offered the woman a crumpled tissue from her dance bag. "My daddy's a hero," she whispered, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "But he doesn't like being one because it makes him sad sometimes." The innocence in her words hit harder than any of the evening's violence. The woman accepted the tissue with trembling fingers, her manicured nails a stark contrast to the rough fabric. "Thank you," she managed, voice barely audible above the wind whistling through bare oak branches. Something flickered in her eyes as she studied Michael more closely, an expression that seemed oddly familiar despite their being strangers. Recognition. confusion. Before he could analyze it further, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "We should go," Michael said softly, already knowing this moment would join the others that haunted his dreams. Katherine Shaw watched the battered pickup disappear into the night, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with the attack. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, scrolling through contacts until she found a number she'd memorized but never called. Her grandfather had given her specific instructions about what to do if she ever encountered the veteran he'd described. "Grandfather?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. "It's Katherine. I found him. The veteran from Pine Ridge you told me about." She paused, watching her breath create small clouds in the frigid air. "He's exactly like you said he'd be." On the other end of the line, Colonel William Shaw's weathered voice carried the weight of 76 years and secrets buried deeper than Arlington graves. "Then it's time, child. Time to repay an old debt that's been weighing on this family for 20 years. His words carried the gravity of military operations and family obligations that transcended simple gratitude. "Bring him home, Katherine." It's time he knew the truth about Pine Ridge, about the community center, about everything we've been doing behind the scenes. The line went quiet, except for the sound of an old soldier's careful breathing. "It's time to make things right." The next morning arrived with the kind of Colorado mountain clarity that made the previous night feel like a fever dream painted in shades of violence and redemption. Michael stood at his trailer's cracked window, watching Lily practice ballet positions in their postage stamp yard, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The coffee in his chipped army surplus mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't stop staring at his hands. They'd moved last night without conscious thought, muscle memory overriding 15 years of careful control. He'd sworn to Sarah's grave that those hands would never hurt another human being again. The rumble of expensive engines shattered his morning reverie like artillery fire echoing through mountain valleys. 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms glided down the rutted trailer park road, with the surreal grace of sharks in a goldfish bowl. Each vehicle represented more wealth than everyone in Pine Ridge Trailer Park would see in their combined lifetimes. Neighbors emerged from their homes like prairie dogs sensing predators, cell phones capturing the impossible sight. Mrs. Henderson from Lot 12 stood in her bathrobe, mouth agape. The Kellys' pit bull stopped barking mid-howl, apparently intimidated by luxury. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 72 cylinders of British engineering came to rest outside Michael's weather-beaten door. Lily pressed her nose against the window, leaving small fingerprints on glass that Michael cleaned religiously every weekend. "Daddy, why are there fancy cars at our house?" Her voice carried the same wonder she'd shown when they'd driven past the governor's mansion last Christmas, the kind of innocent curiosity that made poverty bearable and dreams possible. Michael's throat constricted as uniformed chauffeurs emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise as honor guards at Arlington Cemetery. Each man wore a tailored suit that cost more than Michael made in 3 months of night shifts. The lead driver approached the trailer with an embossed envelope that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent, his polished shoes somehow managing to stay clean despite the muddy pathway. "Mr. Reed," his voice carried the cultured accent of someone educated at expensive schools. "The Shaw family requests your presence at Wildwood Estate to properly express their gratitude for your heroic actions last evening." The formal language felt like something from a different century, A world where gratitude came with protocol and ceremony. They've sent transportation and would be honored by your attendance, along with your daughter, of course. The drive to Wildwood Estate felt like ascending to another planet where physics operated according to different rules. Michael's Ford wheezed and rattled behind the silent convoy, its engine noise embarrassingly loud against the Rolls-Royce whispers. The contrast was so stark it felt intentional, a reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds. Lily sat beside him in her only good dress, a yard sale find that he'd pressed with careful attention to every wrinkle. She practiced saying "thank you" and "please" under her breath, the way Sarah used to coach her before parent-teacher conferences. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter was preparing for a social performance, while he tried to forget how easily his body had remembered violence. 20 minutes of increasingly manicured landscape brought them to iron gates that belonged in a European fairy tale rather than the Colorado Rockies. Wildwood Estate sprawled across 50 acres of mountainside like a medieval castle transplanted by billionaire whimsy and maintained by armies of invisible staff. The main house alone could have housed every family in Pine Ridge Trailer Park, with room left over for their extended relatives. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel as they approached a circular driveway where ornate fountains danced despite the freezing temperature, their water somehow protected from winter's grip by hidden heating systems. "It's like a palace, Daddy." Lily breathed against the window, her voice filled with the kind of awe that made Michael's chest tighten with familiar inadequacy. In her voice, he heard Sarah's dreams of providing their daughter with beauty and wonder, dreams that had died in a twisted metal intersection 3 years ago. The approaching mansion represented everything he'd never been able to give Lily, everything his military pension and night security wages couldn't touch. Yet here they were, invited guests in a world that normally existed only in movies and magazines. The doorman's polished smile faltered like a malfunctioning mask when he saw Michael's pickup truck pulling up behind the luxury convoy. "Service entrances around back," he said with practiced dismissal, his gaze sweeping over Michael's pressed army dress uniform and Lily's carefully combed hair with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of sorting people into categories. The words hit like a slap across the face, carrying decades of class consciousness and inherited prejudice. Before Michael could respond, his daughter stepped forward with the poise of a young queen facing down courtiers. "We're invited guests," Lily said clearly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children possessed when defending their parents. "The Shaw family asked us to come because my daddy saved someone." Her small chin lifted with defiance that made Michael's heart swell with pride and break with recognition. She was defending him the same way he'd defended her from playground bullies and neighborhood gossips who whispered about single fathers and trailer park children. The doorman checked his gilded list twice, surprise flickering across his features like he'd been told the laws of physics had been suspended. James Shaw emerged from shadows that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, moving with the casual confidence that came from never having to check bank balances or worry about utility bills. At 52, he carried himself like a man who'd inherited the world and found it satisfactory, but not particularly exciting. His handmade Italian suit was worth more than Michael's truck, and his handshake carried the firm brevity reserved for necessary unpleasantness. "You must be our Good Samaritan," he said, the phrase carrying subtle condescension wrapped in politeness. "Katherine mentioned you work security. Night shift, I assume?" The casual assumption hit its mark with surgical precision, reducing Michael's military service and current struggles to a simple category that could be dismissed and forgotten. James Shaw had probably never worked a night shift in his life, never counted quarters for gas money, never chosen between groceries and medicine. Yet he spoke with the authority of someone who believed his assumptions were facts rather than prejudices. Michael felt his jaw clench but kept his voice level, the way he'd learned to do when dealing with officers who'd never seen combat but outranked him anyway. Patricia Shaw materialized beside her husband like a designer wraith, her charity gala smile as genuine as campaign promises and twice as empty. Her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup suggested hours of preparation for what she probably considered an unpleasant duty. Oh my, and you're raising a daughter alone. How challenging that must be. Her gaze lingered on Lily's second-hand dress, with the kind of pity that burned worse than outright hostility. Poor dear, you must miss having proper female guidance. Growing up without a mother's touch shows, doesn't it? The words hit Lily like physical blows, each syllable designed to wound with surgical precision. Michael watched his daughter's shoulders tense, her small hand finding his with the desperate trust that kept him sane during the darkest nights. Patricia Shaw had just attacked the most vulnerable part of their lives, the wound that never fully healed, the absence that shaped every day. Michael felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a damaged reactor, the kind of anger that had gotten him into trouble with superior officers who mistook restraint for weakness. The Shaw family parlor could have housed 3 trailers comfortably, its vaulted ceilings and marble columns suggesting old-world wealth transplanted to new-world mountains. Oil paintings worth small fortunes watched from gilt frames as Michael and Lily perched on antique furniture that probably predated Colorado statehood. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that required armies of invisible servants to maintain. The room felt like a museum where they were unwelcome exhibits rather than honored guests. Katherine sat across from them in a chair that probably had its own insurance policy, her earlier vulnerability replaced by the polished composure that came from expensive education and inherited privilege. Yet something flickered in her eyes when she looked at Lily, a softness that seemed genuine in a room full of performances and social theatre. She wore different clothes now, designer casual that still cost more than Michael's monthly salary, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a service that looked like it belonged in Buckingham Palace. "I've taken the liberty of preparing compensation for your heroic actions," James announced, sliding an envelope across a mahogany table that could have been carved from a single ancient tree. The envelope sat between them like a gauntlet thrown down, its thick paper and embossed letterhead speaking of serious money and serious expectations. $10,000 should provide adequate compensation for the risks you undertook on our family's behalf. The money represented 4 months of Michael's salary, more cash than he'd seen in one place since his military discharge. Behind him, Michael heard Lily's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a 10-year-old doing rapid mental calculations about ballet lessons and new clothes and maybe even a better trailer. $10,000 could buy security he'd never been able to provide, opportunities that remained dreams on his current salary. It could buy his daughter the kind of stability that would let her sleep without worrying about whether Daddy would come home from work. But the way James presented it, like payment for services rendered rather than gratitude for moral action, made his stomach turn like spoiled food. Most security guards make $25,000 annually, correct? James continued, his tone suggesting he'd researched Michael's exact financial desperation with the thoroughness of a corporate acquisition. This represents significant generosity on our part, more than adequate compensation for a few minutes of work. The words carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to choose between heating bills and groceries, never had to explain to a child why Christmas would be modest again this year. Each phrase was designed to remind Michael of his place in the social hierarchy. The silence stretched like a taut wire between them, broken only by the tick of a grandfather clock that probably cost more than Michael's truck. Patricia Shaw watched with the satisfied expression of someone witnessing expected entertainment, while Katherine seemed to shrink into her expensive chair. Lily's small hand found his, squeezing with the kind of trust that made every sacrifice worthwhile. When she finally spoke, her whisper cut through the tension like a blade forged from pure innocence. "Daddy, heroes don't take money for helping people. That's what you taught me." The words hung in the air like a moral challenge that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Michael felt something crystallize in his chest, the same clarity that had guided him through ambushes and firefights when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He stood slowly, decision forming with the weight of absolute certainty. "I don't need your cars," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded soldiers in combat zones. "I just need my daughter to know her dad did the right thing." The rejection hit the room like a mortar round, shattering the careful social dynamics that money usually guaranteed. James Shaw's carefully maintained composure cracked like expensive veneer under pressure, revealing something ugly and entitled underneath. His face flushed red as his voice rose to match his blood pressure. "Excuse me?" "Do you realize who you're speaking to? I could have you arrested for assault, thrown in prison where you belong." The threat landed with all the subtlety of a brick through a window, carrying the implicit message that justice was another commodity the Shaw family could purchase. No one refuses our generosity and walks away unscathed. "For protecting your daughter?" Michael's voice remained steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, the same chemical cocktail that had kept him alive in Afghanistan when superior firepower faced him from multiple directions. "For stopping 3 men who were about to hurt someone you claim to love." The questions hung in the air like accusations, each word chosen with the precision of a sniper selecting targets. Behind James, Patricia's mask slipped entirely, revealing the kind of entitled rage that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. "How dare you lecture us?" Patricia's voice cracked like a whip, decades of unconscious superiority pouring out in a torrent of class-conscious venom. "We're trying to help you people, trying to lift you up from your pathetic circumstances, and this is how you respond." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like a racial slur, dripping with the kind of casual bigotry that treated human worth as a mathematical equation based on bank balances and zip codes. "You should be grateful that we even acknowledge your existence." Lily stepped between the adults with the fearless courage of childhood, her voice cutting through the toxic atmosphere like a tuning fork striking pure truth. "My daddy saved your family. That makes him a hero. Heroes are better than mean people with money." Her words carried the absolute moral clarity that adults spent lifetimes trying to rediscover. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the tick of that grandfather clock and the sound of everyone's breathing, harsh and rapid in the suddenly poisonous atmosphere. For a moment, the only sound was collective shock at being morally educated by a 10-year-old in a yard sale dress. From the library doorway came the measured footsteps of military bearing, each step precise as a drill sergeant's cadence on a parade ground. The sound carried authority that money couldn't buy, and respect that couldn't be inherited. "The child's absolutely right, James." The voice belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, carrying the weight of earned command rather than inherited privilege. Colonel William Shaw entered the parlor like morning sun breaking through storm clouds, his 76-year-old frame still straight as a flagpole despite decades of wear and accumulated scars. Ribbons and medals decorated the study walls behind him, testament to battles fought in jungles and deserts that James Shaw had only seen in movies and history books. The Purple Heart, the Silver Star, the Combat Infantry Badge. Each decoration represented blood spilled and courage demonstrated in places where money meant nothing and character meant everything. The colonel's presence changed the room's dynamics like a senior officer arriving at a court-martial, shifting power balances that had seemed fixed and immutable. Michael's posture shifted automatically, shoulders squaring in recognition of superior rank despite decades of civilian life. Military bearing was like a second language that never fully faded, a form of communication that transcended service branches and combat theaters. "Sergeant Michael Reed," the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of official records and personal knowledge. "1st Battalion, 75th Rangers, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Afghanistan, 2009 through 2011. Recognition flooded Michael's system like ice water, the realization that this man knew exactly who he was, had known before the attack, before the rescue, before everything. The colonel's weathered hands moved to his shirt buttons with the deliberate precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. His chest revealed shrapnel scars that crisscrossed pale skin like a road map of violence, each mark telling stories of battles fought in places that no longer existed on modern maps. Tet Offensive 1968. Lost my entire squad in the first hour. His voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that every combat veteran understood. Came home to a family who thought money could heal what war had broken. His gaze swept over James and Patricia with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Sound familiar, soldier? The question hung between them like a bridge across decades of shared understanding, connecting two men who'd learned the same bitter lessons in different wars. Michael felt recognition dawning, the understanding that came from meeting someone who'd walked the same dark paths and emerged scarred but intact. Combat veterans recognized each other the way wolves identified pack members, through subtle signals that civilians couldn't interpret. The colonel had arranged this entire encounter, had been watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal truths that had been building for years. Catherine's voice broke the silence, trembling with revelations that had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks. "Grandpa sent me to Pine Ridge. He's been anonymously funding the community center for 20 years. The words hit the room like mortar rounds, each one reshaping the tactical situation and revealing hidden objectives. Michael's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't known existed, understanding finally dawning like sunrise after the longest night. The mysterious donations that kept the community center running when government funding dried up. The scholarships that helped trailer park kids attend decent schools instead of dropping out like their parents. The food banks that never seemed to run empty despite serving a population that couldn't afford to be generous. The veteran support groups that provided counseling and camaraderie for broken soldiers trying to find their way back to humanity. all funded by guilt money from a war the colonel couldn't forget, and a family that preferred to ignore the cost of freedom. Those men last night weren't random criminals, the colonel continued, his voice carrying the weight of confession and the burden of good intentions gone wrong. They were private security I hired to create a controlled situation. Aha! Michael's blood pressure spiked as understanding dawned like a slap across the face. The attack had been theater, a carefully orchestrated test that had gone horribly wrong. "You set this up?" The question came out harder than intended, tinged with the kind of betrayal that turned allies into enemies in combat zones where trust was the only currency that mattered. "Not the way it happened," the colonel said quickly, his voice carrying the urgency of someone trying to prevent a friendly fire incident. "I wanted Katherine to understand our community work. The scenario was supposed to be minor harassment. Let her experience helplessness so she'd understand why our mission matters." His explanation sounded like a military briefing gone wrong. Good intentions twisted by Murphy's Law into dangerous reality. "I never expected real violence, never expected you to be there, never expected everything to spiral out of control like it did." The truth unraveled like a poorly woven lie, each thread revealing more of the complex web that had brought them together. Katherine's voice shook as she explained how the test had become reality, how the hired actors had gotten aggressive when they saw her actually fighting back. "The attack became real when they thought I was genuinely trying to escape," she whispered, her composure cracking like thin ice under pressure. Grandpa's careful plan turned into the kind of situation he'd been training me to recognize. They weren't supposed to actually hurt me. Michael's jaw clenched as he processed the implications, the cascade of unintended consequences that had flowed from one old soldier's desire to educate his granddaughter, his PTSD episode triggered by the violence, Lily's trauma from witnessing the attack, his own moral crisis about returning to violence after years of peaceful civilian life, all downstream effects of a wealthy man's social experiment gone wrong, collateral damage from good intentions that had exploded like faulty ordnance. "You're the anonymous donor keeping Pine Ridge alive," Michael stated, the pieces finally clicking into place, like a weapon being field-stripped and reassembled. For 20 years, Colonel Shaw had been the invisible hand keeping their community from complete collapse, the guardian angel who prevented gentrification and provided hope where government policies offered only abandonment. Every Christmas dinner at the community center that fed families who couldn't afford holiday meals. Every after-school program that kept kids off the streets and away from the kind of trouble that destroyed futures. Every veteran support group that helped broken soldiers find their way back to humanity, providing the kind of counseling and camaraderie that the VA couldn't offer and society didn't understand, all funded by one man's guilt over surviving when better men had died, channeled into protection for the kind of community he'd fought to defend. Michael felt the weight of 20 years of secret generosity, the burden of debt that could never be repaid, because it had been given freely and without expectation. James Shaw's face cycled through expressions like a computer processing conflicting data, his worldview reshaping itself in real time as family secrets emerged like classified documents being declassified. "You've been funding the place I'm trying to demolish?" The question carried the weight of betrayed assumptions and shattered business plans. His development company had spent months planning Pine Ridge's transformation into luxury condominiums, never knowing his own father had been its guardian angel. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. "Your grandfather fought in 3 wars to protect communities," the colonel said, his voice heavy with disappointment that ran deeper than family politics. "You're destroying them for profit margins." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from burning buildings, carrying the weight of generational failure and inherited shame. James Shaw represented everything the Colonel had feared his family might become: wealthy, comfortable, and disconnected from the sacrifices that had made their comfort possible. Lily's innocent wisdom cut through the family tension like a child's drawing displayed in a corporate boardroom. Simple truth that complex adult reasoning had somehow missed. "Why can't you just build nice houses without making people leave?" "In my coloring books, there's room for everyone." The adults fell silent, each processing the simple logic that their billion-dollar consultations and market research had failed to produce. From the mouths of babes came the kind of solution that expensive education and inherited wealth couldn't conceive. The Colonel turned to Michael with the gravity of a field promotion being offered in the middle of a firefight. "I'm 76, son. I need someone to carry on this work. Not charity. Partnership. Help me protect communities like Pine Ridge." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, representing possibilities that Michael had never dared imagine. Community Development Director. 75,000 annual salary. Healthcare benefits that would cover Lily's needs. Educational support that could give his daughter opportunities he'd never been able to provide. Patricia Shaw's resistance crackled like static electricity before a thunderstorm, her voice carrying the kind of class consciousness that treated human worth as a mathematical equation. "William, surely you're not suggesting this person join our family business?" Her words dripped with the casual bigotry of someone who'd never questioned their own assumptions about merit and worth. The Colonel's response carried the quiet authority of a man who'd earned his opinions in places where money meant nothing and character meant everything. "I'm suggesting he save it." Michael knelt to Lily's eye level, seeking wisdom in her 10-year-old honesty, the way he'd once sought cover during enemy fire. Her face carried the absolute trust that had kept him sane during the darkest nights, the unwavering faith that Daddy would always make the right choice, even when the right choice wasn't clear. "What do you think, sweetheart? Should Daddy help the nice Colonel protect families like ours?" Her response came without hesitation, the kind of moral clarity that adults spent lifetimes trying to rediscover. "If you help them, can other little girls keep their ballet classes?" The question crystallized everything into perfect focus, reducing complex adult considerations to their essential core. This wasn't about accepting charity or betraying pride or navigating class differences. This was about multiplication of good works, about using unexpected opportunities to help others the way they'd been helped. Michael felt the same clarity he'd experienced in combat when complex tactical situations suddenly became simple moral choices. "Yes," he said, standing to face the Colonel. "We can help a lot of families keep their ballet classes." 6 months later, Michael stood in his new office overlooking the Pine Ridge Community Center, watching Lily and Katherine paint a mural with neighborhood kids whose laughter carried through double-paned windows. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy, like most worthwhile changes that required patience and persistence rather than quick fixes. Those first weeks had felt like learning to walk again, navigating corporate structures and board meetings with the same careful attention he'd once applied to clearing minefields in hostile territory. The Colonel had been patient, sharing war stories over coffee while teaching Michael that business could serve community instead of consuming it. Their morning meetings had become tutorials in applied compassion, lessons in how wealth could be wielded as a weapon against poverty rather than a barrier protecting privilege. Michael learned to read financial statements the way he'd once read terrain maps, looking for strategic advantages that could benefit entire neighborhoods rather than individual portfolios. The renovation projects had started small and grown steadily, like seeds planted in fertile ground and tended with careful attention. Upgraded plumbing for 12 trailer families meant children could bathe in clean water and parents could wash dishes without worrying about contamination. A new playground where children could play safely meant working parents could stop worrying about supervision and focus on keeping jobs that kept families together. Community gardens where neighbors grew vegetables together meant fresh food for families who couldn't afford grocery store prices. Each improvement preserved neighborhood character while addressing real needs, like careful surgery that healed without scarring. Mixed-income housing rose gradually, designed to blend rather than dominate, creating opportunities for upward mobility without destroying the community connections that made survival possible. The work felt like reconstruction in the best sense, building up rather than tearing down, creating rather than consuming. James Shaw's transformation had taken longer, measured in monthly dinners where he learned about veteran struggles and slowly understood how development could destroy communities rather than improve them. The man who'd once seen Pine Ridge as a profit opportunity now attended veteran support groups, learning about PTSD and changing company policies to hire more former soldiers. Not a perfect transformation, but genuine effort counted for something in Michael's book, especially when that effort translated into concrete help for people who needed it. Patricia Shaw remained distant, but had stopped her open hostility, apparently deciding that ignoring Michael was preferable to fighting battles she couldn't win. Her charity work had taken on a different character, less about photo opportunities and more about actual assistance. Small steps, but steps nonetheless in the right direction. Change was possible even for people who'd spent decades believing their own propaganda about merit and worth. Lily bloomed in the new environment like a flower finding proper soil and sunlight after years of struggle. Still shy but confident enough to help newer kids at the community center, teaching them the same kindness she'd learned from watching her father's example. Katherine had become a genuine big sister figure, teaching art classes and learning social work through hands-on experience rather than textbook theory. Her manicured nails had disappeared, replaced by calluses from construction work and paint stains from children's art projects. Michael's personal healing had been the slowest transformation of all, like bones knitting back together after complex fractures. Regular therapy through VA benefits the Colonel had helped him access meant dealing with trauma instead of just enduring it. PTSD symptoms managed better when purpose-driven work replaced mere survival, when helping others provided meaning that individual achievement couldn't match. Sleep improved when helping others instead of just enduring each day, when exhaustion came from good work rather than simple endurance. The nightmares still came sometimes, memories of Afghan villages and improvised explosives that therapy couldn't completely erase. But they competed now with dreams of community gardens and children's laughter, with visions of families succeeding instead of simply surviving. The balance was shifting, hope outweighing despair in the long-term calculus of recovery. Healing wasn't linear, but it was possible when supported by purpose and community. On this particular Monday morning, Michael's phone buzzed with the kind of emergency call that had become routine in his new role. Another community across town faced mass evictions, families needing an advocate who understood both military discipline and civilian bureaucracy. He grabbed his jacket, no longer alone in the fight against institutional indifference. A team of community organizers he'd trained waited in the parking lot. Some veterans, some former Pine Ridge residents, all united by shared purpose and proven methods. Through his office window, he heard Lily explaining to a younger child why they were painting a mural of families holding hands under rainbow skies. "My daddy says heroes help people every day, not just once. And when heroes help people, those people become heroes too, and they help other people." Her voice carried the same confidence that had asked him to help a stranger in an alley 6 months ago. The circle was completing itself in ways he never could have imagined, rippling outward like stones thrown in still water. At the traffic light, Michael saw his former co-worker from the grocery store night shift, still struggling with the same financial pressures that had once defined Michael's existence. They nodded in recognition across the intersection. No guilt in the exchange, just gratitude for opportunities earned through courage rather than luck. Some people got breaks, others made breaks. The difference lay in recognizing moments when action mattered more than safety, when character counted more than comfort. Katherine approached his truck as he prepared to leave for the new community crisis, her transformation from sheltered rich girl to passionate advocate evident in every gesture. "3 more families need housing assistance. I already started the paperwork, but they'll need someone to walk them through the process." Her voice carried the confidence that came from real experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "Let's go help them," Michael replied, starting the engine that had carried him from desperation to purpose. He still drove the same Ford pickup, could afford something newer, but kept it as a reminder of the journey from survival to service. The radio crackled with reports of the community meeting scheduled for that evening. Families organizing against predatory landlords who saw human shelter as profit opportunities rather than basic rights. Michael's work was expanding beyond Pine Ridge, rippling outward like waves from a stone thrown in still water, each success creating possibilities for the next victory. Driving past the alley where everything had changed, Lily noticed the location with the kind of memory that children possessed for moments that reshaped their understanding of the world. "That's where you saved Katherine, right, Daddy?" Her question carried no trauma, just curiosity about the night that had moved them from one life to another. "Where we all saved each other," Michael corrected, understanding now that rescue was a mutual process rather than a unilateral action, that helping others was often the best way to help yourself. As they drove toward the new challenge, Michael realized the greatest gift hadn't been financial security or stable employment, important as those things were for practical survival. It was showing Lily that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over comfort, when they recognized that helping others was the fastest way to help themselves. The lesson would serve her better than any trust fund or inheritance, a legacy measured in lives touched rather than dollars accumulated. Success, he'd learned, wasn't about wealth accumulated, but communities strengthened and families preserved from the kind of institutional indifference that treated human beings as obstacles to profit. The true victory was raising a daughter who believed helping others was normal, expected, necessary, rather than exceptional. Heroes weren't born fully formed, but made through daily choices to act when action mattered most, to stand up when standing up was difficult. Class barriers dissolved when people recognized shared humanity and common values, when they understood that dignity couldn't be purchased, but had to be earned through actions rather than inherited through accidents of birth. Sometimes a father's integrity became the foundation for both family and community healing, creating ripple effects that outlasted any individual lifetime and proved that the smallest acts of courage could reshape entire worlds. In the rearview mirror, Pine Ridge bustled with the kind of life that money couldn't buy, but courage could create. Children played on new equipment while elderly residents tended community gardens, and teenagers learned trades that would support future families. One decision to help a stranger had created ripple effects that would outlast any individual lifetime, proving that the smallest acts of courage could reshape entire worlds when guided by love rather than self-interest.